All right, gang. Alex is here again. Yay.
You guys are kind. This maybe sounds morbid, but like grief and loss is one of my favorite things to talk about. I think the first couple, all of the things that we're talking about together, I feel like are really vital and super important. But the reason that I think grief and loss, partly probably just personally, I think it touches on a lot of my experiences. But I think that we are grieving all over the place, whether we realize it or not. So to actually tune into something that feels so painful and that we start to try to avoid at any cost. So I think, kind of actually where we're going is expanding some of the definition of grief to include more than the death of someone we love. That it is that too, but it's way more than that. And I think just to start, I am curious, like in your guys' team, sometimes I think it's a little more broad than just here. We think about all of life, but do you feel like there is like room or support kind of in like your own lives when this thing of like sadness, grief, or loss comes up? Just what's your initial?
Is there room? Is that what you said?
Is there room for it? Yeah.
Does that mean, like time, people, like what do you?
Well, say more what you're thinking by that. Like time or people. Do you think like do people make time?
Do I have the right people in my life?
Yeah.
And do I have enough to stop and grieve?
Yeah.
Grieve, basically.
Yeah, what do I mean by this? I think that, so you touched on something that's like, okay, we shouldn't maybe do it alone or like by ourselves. That's like the whole people component. But maybe just to say kind of like what I'm thinking in my mind is so much of a strategy around grief is avoidance or to stuff it down. So maybe like as I'm sitting here talking out loud, it's actually more this idea that I think we naturally, just as human beings, try to get away from something that literally feels like a present hell in some ways. And we try to like really stuff it down, or we just try to avoid it in a lot of ways. So really maybe the question is, do we make room for grief? No. There's, I wasn't thinking about this when I put this together, but I think it's a Jewish practice where they'll come and sit Shiva, I don't know exactly how to say that, where they will just, and it's something like 8 days or longer, but like they have just people come and sit and like cry and be with and really like put aside all things when like something shifts. Yeah, so beautiful. And I think that, companies have bereavement policies, and I think that's so powerful to hear you say I had a good experience here where I felt supported, because I couldn't have continued on without it. So to have like that positive, or that picture, that paints a picture of practically what does it look like to actually wrap tight around each other in the midst of grief. Thanks for sharing that. Anything else before we kind of move along? Anybody else have any other thoughts?
I wonder if it's like an American pressure too, to just keep going, because I don't know if it's international. I think it's our rat race experience of American kind of just,
Yeah. And again, if we do give you a bereavement, it's only like maybe a few days. Let's think through like literally a company's policy. What do we allow for grief? We allow you a few days off to go to a funeral, and then we'll see you back here as soon as possible. Like there's something about that doesn't jive with the lived experience of what grief is. So I think coming back to culture, I think that's important. I'm like nugging that mind to talk through later. I just put this in here because I feel like we've touched on so many different things, and these are some of, we've covered so much ground between emotions, and we've kind of inadvertently, like kind of around the thing, talked on shame. And shame, I feel like, really is at the base of all emotional unwellness in some ways. And obviously, Brene Brown, the Daring Greatly book, goes up there because, like I said, she's my girl. But The Soul of Shame, that's a great book. He wrote also, I haven't read this one, but The Anatomy of the Soul. But this he looks at and adds to maybe the conversation of actually maybe shame is Satan's primary tool to inhibit creativity that allows us as God's people to advance kingdom work.
come on.
Yeah.
It's the soul of shame.
The Soul of Shame, yeah.
Can you say that again?
that he really writes about, okay, we see shame interwove through the storyline of the Bible, and that Satan's primary tool to inhibit creativity in his people is through shame, and it actually like inhibits advancing the kingdom of God.
Wow.
Beautiful book. Yeah, we're done for today. No. Oh, you guys are great. This one, Prescriptions and Descriptions, is a really short book, and it is a medical doctor who writes on the mind-body connection. Should we go to counseling? Should we take drugs? What are these drugs? All these different things. And he writes some nuance too on just like, I have some quotes from him in here, like this thing of suffering. Like, how does God use our suffering and our pain, even like pain like anxiety and depression that isn't like real physical pain, but it's there in our lives. And then for grief and loss, which is really applicable, morning, I think, to our conversation today, A Grace Disguised is a beautiful book. The man who wrote it, he actually attended, when I was in grad school, got to sit down and have lunch with him. And he writes about grief and loss after having experienced an atrocity. He was driving his mom, his wife, his daughter, and then I think his other kids, and a drunk driver hits them on, and 3 generations of women are killed in that car accident. Right? So we don't want to compare grief and loss. We don't want to compare suffering, because pain is pain. But by golly, does he actually have a lived experience to write on these things. And some of the imagery he uses in those books are just so beautiful. I also think adults should read a lot more children's books, because it really like simmers down. Tear Soup, it's a children's book, and it's on grief. So I just wanted to highlight some of those things as like we're wrapping up this series in some ways. It's like maybe what's some things you can sink your teeth into and get more of this flushed out than we could do like an hour on a Tuesday morning. This we kind of talked about, but really shame is the foundation that underlies mental and emotional unhealth. I cannot tell you, I would say 100% of the people who see me in the counseling practice, what we end up doing is shame work. And nobody wants to say that they have shame. It feels like I'm a functioning human, but perfectionism is like modern day shame. I'm trying to, I hear you. It's like I'm trying to make up for something that's lacking in a frenzy almost. So shame, fear, which I feel like is a lot about anger and attachment when we spent time there. Fear is actually the foundation of this anger and anxiety experience that we see. But then we get into loss, and loss is really wrapped up in this thing of depression and grief. So where is maybe something like life as I know it has ceased to exist in some way, and that I'm experiencing as a loss, and that will then show up in grief or depression. So that's kind of, I just wanted to hit that as an overview. I feel like we've been so many different places as we've spent time together. So you, I feel like, said a lot of this stuff already when it comes to how do we even categorize people's loss? How much time do we give to grief? What's a loss that's better or worse than others? Mm-hmm. We have all these categories in our brain and in our system that we start to fit people into. So even like, let's say we move away from like the company policy of a few days and we just think of like a friend. Let me think of an example of me doing it negatively in my own life. I have a friend, sadly her marriage has come to an end. And it's been about a 1.5-year process to finally sign divorce papers, and just a really sad, honestly, like I should have more compassion within me, but I noticed within myself about 6 months in that there was a shift in me that was kind of like, okay, like, can we talk about something else? Can we move, maybe is there space for me in this conversation? Like there was this shift that even though I would definitely, like I'm a counselor, I should be very like therapeutically responding to her, right? But kind of in this whole timeline, it's kind of at different points in times I've noticed within me, oh, we've done enough grief work. Like it's time to move on and get back up in life. And I'm curious if you guys have similar experiences. I think even personally, how often have we maybe been misattuned to in a moment of maybe any type of emotional unrest that you're working really hard to clue somebody in and they're just not hearing you. that in a way is kind of
Pulling them in to grieve with you.
yeah, and they just can't quite hear you. You know, if you ever have time, we won't do it this morning, pair up with each other and one person like intentionally try to mislead the conversation. It feels terrible.
Yes.
It feels like terrible because it's like I'm really trying to like clue you in, but you just aren't. It feels like the most uncaring thing. So how do we engage people to be like, hey, what you're doing is not okay, but then also start to realize when we are contributing to some of that.
But who are we cluing in that it's not? For example, if I'm grieving, I'm talking
Yeah.
to, I should clue them in.
I think
Like,
so sometimes.
Okay.
Here's the unfortunate thing. If you're already in pain, how hard is it to clue somebody in?
Yeah.
To reach out and be like, hey, I need you. I need to talk about this. That is actually, I think, like asking for what we need is some of the hardest things we ever have to do. And
Because there's the risk of not getting it.
there's a risk of not getting it. And I think that it's just something like terribly wrong with our system that the person who's in pain has to be the one to ask or communicate. You know, they should just, it's kind of an injustice in and of itself. I think about this a lot with trauma. I was talking to someone yesterday and she was like, why am I the one who can't date somebody because I've been harmed in like relationships and stuff like that, and he's just off scotch-free. You know, there's like an anger and injustice piece that the person who's in pain would have to clue anybody into anything. But that's just the way it is. So I think oftentimes like a way I like to think about it is with many things, whether you're on a giving or receiving side, is how do you be the person who takes the first step in some way in moving towards somebody? Because I find that when we speak from our hearts, people move towards us. There's something about that draws somebody in. Did that hit on what you're talking about? Yeah. What about the legitimate losses piece? What do we count when we hear? What is it when we hear something that's happened to somebody? What makes us go, oh my gosh? You know, what's kind of our category for a legitimate loss? Death. Yeah. This happened to me last night. I was at Bible study, and someone was telling a story about a man who was holding an infant. A grandpa was holding an infant on a cruise ship. That then the infant. I know exactly. There's that experience. That's a legitimate loss. I didn't mean to tell you that to kind of get that, but like there's something about it that this is not right. You know. So death is definitely one of them. It's kind of the big one. Divorce, which is a death in and of itself. Yeah. Let me actually move forward. I'll just come here. I think that there's two ways to define. When I think about legitimate loss, we often think about it in this real category. And again, like using the language as something, life as I know it has ceased to exist. So a divorce, I have heard so many people, you know, my mom included, that talks about it as a death. That the relationship has died, you know, loss of a job, infertility, all these different things. There's a sense of, there's something real that has or is happening that we would look at that and be like, that's an atrocity. That's not the way it should be. And it's easy to kind of wrap our minds around real grief. What I want to do with you guys is kind of expand that definition to where are these things that are actually more symbolic some way. You know, we think in a positive frame, maybe like a rite of passage, that someone graduates high school as like a rite of passage. What are different things that like a boy becomes a man? You're leaving a season of life and there's like a loss in some ways, whether or not you're moving forward positively or negatively. If I can think of like a couple, let me think of some examples from my own life. Well, maybe just even that first one. You know, this is like even part of my like own story. I remember as a 13 or 14-year-old girl sitting with my mom, going through and swapping out the seasons of clothes. And I have older sisters, and let's just be honest, I was like a chubby kid. So like year after year to see my mom crying, I'm like, why are you crying? I should be crying. But my mom, bless her heart, she had a lot going on. She's crying because none of these clothes fit me. And I remember finally at one moment in time just being like, oh, there's something wrong with me. And to have carried that forward into like years and years and years. I talk about shame. There's something about some of these symbolic things that land as shame in our lives, or feeling orphaned. You know, I come from my parents got divorced maybe like 6-7 years ago, and divorce and the symbolic of like, oh, you know what, I have both my parents, but at times, especially around the holidays, I feel a sense of fatherlessness and motherlessness, familylessness, you know. So this is, I think when we try to expand it, that it would actually include some of these things too. It's very real. And this is, you know, it's even probably not great to put that real and symbolic because it's all real grief. But really that phrase of like, life as I know it has ceased to exist, even my expectations. And this is why I love talking about this topic, because we really are doing it all the time. I think like really, you know, to maybe put before you guys that we should be like a grieving people actually, that constantly is taking stock and letting go and moving forward in some capacity, but all in like a position of what am I honoring? Like you said, that person really honored my grief. They honored this process of me letting go. So any transition is grief. Any movement, even, you know, if you work with kind of young kids, I think there's transitions that happen from school to the weekend and weekend back to school. And how many fits of rage come Sunday night? You know, I don't know how many of you guys have kids. I don't have any kids, but I've worked with kids, and parents report that as a problem.
Sunday nights and Monday mornings
yeah, yep, bedtime. Bedtime is a transition from day to night. What'd you say?
I was just saying it feels like every night.
Every night? Yeah,
Going into the weekend.
and then they're fine. Yeah, exactly.
Friday night's okay.
Yeah, but even like for us, it's like, oh, we are actually transitioning all the time, but maybe we don't tune in. Like it's easier to tune in for a child and make some structure, but for us, it's like, it's kind of the same. We're grieving all the time. We're transitioning, if we make those synonyms, we're transitioning all the time. Yeah, go ahead.
Just that made me think of something that was kind of like the reverse, but I think about how many young people grieve, like leaving school and coming home.
Oh, yeah.
Not even just like on the weekends, but on the basis of nightly because of what might be at home or happen at home.
Yeah. That school is more of my safe place.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So I almost kind of prepare myself to head back into, again, like a living hell in some ways. Yeah. Yeah. You know, no matter how we start to categorize grief and loss, it ends up registering, again, like the mind-body connection, it will always register the same way in our bodies, and that is grief. This sadness, this depression, this kind of melancholy that, you know, I forget where I heard this, but someone was talking about, so I can't even reference where I heard this, which is terrible, but they were talking about anytime you have an emotional experience, and oftentimes a negative one, depression, anxiety, grief, you know, all these different things, it's actually your body trying to tell you something and is often preparing for a transition in some ways. So all of this stuff, while you don't want to be reactive to your emotions, you do want to tune in, because I think even like they're God's gift to help guide and discern life ahead and kind of keep moving. But no matter how we categorize it, it'll always end up the same, grief. These, you know, I put these up here. Well, first of all, I want to kind of come against the 5 stages of grief a little bit. Who's familiar with the 5 stages of grief? Yeah? Let me just read through them. It's like this idea that we move progressively, like we start and we move progressively through grieving and then we're done. So it's, you go through the denial stage, the anger stage, the bargaining stage, the depression stage, the acceptance stage, and then you're done grieving. That was designed in a geriatric unit for chronic, ready-to-die patients. And how does that maybe look different for someone who actually is trying to accept death, because maybe they're hours or days away from it, versus us who are actually called to keep living?
Right.
You know, that's got to be different. So I think...
Was that distributed as across the board?
Oh, it is like common knowledge. Yeah, I'm curious kind of what you know about it.
I just feel like I've heard it about it for years and heard it as kind of like the standard, like a theory.
Yeah.
It's a theory, but held almost like a truth.
Yes. And I think it is helpful in a lot of ways, but this progressive movement I don't think is helpful. I think more to think about it as like waves or cycles. that at one point in time, maybe I do accept this thing and put it away from me. Let's take divorce and feeling orphaned for me. At different points in time, there's like a majority of the time, I love my family, by the way, but there's a majority of time that I live out of that space. I have good relationships with my parents and all these different things. And then again, kind of my birthday, the holidays, all these kind of key things that brings up this maybe anger, maybe sadness, maybe all this different stuff, and to kind of redo that again. So I think more to think of maybe even an ocean, that you have like these waves that actually wash over us. And I think that's true to like the lived experience, that all of a sudden you can be normal and then whoosh, like, I don't know why I'm crying, I don't know why I'm thinking about this person that I loved who died so much in this moment. And it really just kind of washes over us in this way. I think sometimes we can think of life, this is I think a good picture in some ways. Can you guys see that okay? I don't know if we can see it in the camera. But if you think of like born and your life that you live, that other significant things, let's think of, let me think of an example. Let's just stick with my parents' divorce. That I am living life and my parents get divorced, and it's hard at this point in time. And then I'm fine, I don't even think about it, life goes on. And then let's say I meet somebody and we decide to get married. At that key point in life, how does that come up in some ways? It's not like it's constant, you're not constantly grieving in this stage, but that it is kind of, I would actually maybe hypothesize that we never stop, we're never done, because I think that with like great sorrow comes from great love. Like it actually is significant that I loved something really, something was really important to me that, I don't know, I think it's maybe part of like honoring it is continuing to let that live on inside of us in some ways. Not that we always have to be crying, but that we carry the significance of that with us.
I wonder if, like, when you think of Jesus, he has the scars still in his resurrected body.
Man of sorrows, yeah.
I wonder, like, we will see him, we will see his scars, and it's like, I don't think we'll be like, yay! I think there's going to be a level of like, wow. It's a remembrance, right? That brings pain, but that tears are wiped away. So I know. It's interesting that he still has his scars on his physical body. So
something I've been thinking about in the last few weeks, this is just things I think about, is, oh gosh, will there actually be some type of better sadness in heaven? Like a perfect sadness? Because emotions aren't actually bad, and this is something, we don't have to talk about this now, but it's something I think about, that, that's all I have to say about that, actually. But what is this thing that even Jesus, like, carries that forward? And when we get to heaven, that we will see and like worship and be glad, but also like, oh, that came at a cost. There was a loss there in order to gain something. Yeah. I put these different strategies up there because I just want to say that they're normal. I think that the stuffing and the avoiding is actually very normal behavior that we would put on these different things. And they're instinctual almost because they're kind of one way to cope and get through. But again, I think that the idea that we're gonna like just white knuckle or automatically move through grief, or when will it be done, I think that that's not always the best way to think about it, and it's a little ambiguous and vague. I don't even know if that feels like a satisfactory answer, because it's like, oh, I don't know if it really ends at any point in time, but it looks different at different points in time, I would say. So these all work well until they don't, I would say.
So
what is bargaining?
Are these, could you explain them?
Oh yeah, please, sorry.
Could you explain each of those?
Yeah.
And how it
absolutely
shows up?
Let me think. So denial. I'm kind of stuck in my mind on a hospital and like life situations that maybe someone would. Let's say an individual gets a cancer diagnosis, but they decide not to get treatment and they live life as they were, as just as before, and they don't tell any family members. I remember getting to know this woman in Wheaton. It was just like a random connection, and she hadn't even ever told her husband. She was telling me for some reason, and we just randomly met. but she had not even
You got that.
That happens all the time.
yeah, sit by me on the bus and I'll listen to you for a long time. But she was saying, she's like, yeah, I don't want people to treat me different, and I don't want to treat myself differently. So I'm just going to deny that it actually is happening.
Dang.
That's rough.
Yeah, but I think that there's milder ways that we can do that. I can't think of anything but extreme examples in this moment. So maybe that'll be it. Is that enough for denial?
Yeah.
That we're just kind of like, no, we're not gonna like.
We
This
know it
isn't even
exists, but we're not
happening.
gonna
Life
address
is
it.
fine. Yeah.
That's
Bar-
real popular in churchy-esque religiosity
Oh yeah.
settings, right?
How much is responding to
smile.
somebody like, "Ooh, God works all things together for good." So like, don't like just put it out of your mind. I think there's something very true there, and it's a little bit kind of like, I'm not gonna deal with it because it's all just gonna work out, you know. Bargaining in some ways is, well, think of like in the Christian world, how much of have we ever prayed, God, if you do this, like, I will love you and serve you in a different way.
Yeah.
You know, that and I think bargaining is kind of in the realm of dealing with like the cosmic in some ways, that we're going to go to the person who holds the power and actually try to negotiate, have some sense of control, which is funny because we actually have no control in that situation. But it's like a strategy we put on, you know, like if I just, I don't know, like read my Bible and pray enough, maybe this thing will go away in some capacity. Indulging, it's kind of like self-medicating in some way. I don't know, the pint of ice cream, like binge watching Netflix, shopping. Yeah, maybe that's a big one for me. Actually, I feel convicted. But like this indulgent, I'm gonna try to be so intensely in my moment in an excessive way that it kind of drowns out life. But then it's like, well, now my credit card's maxed out, and now my tummy feels sick, and like, and this thing is still here. It didn't go away. Venting anger, again, is kind of normal, but like, and I think it's actually really good in some ways. I look for people to be angry when I work with them in counseling. But it's again, it works until it doesn't. When do you need to maybe not stop being angry, but also experience these other things and live life still, that you're not just a big angry mass. Yeah. Does that help with those?
Yeah.
But here's the thing. These are all very normal responses. I don't want to put these up here to shame people, because I think if people are doing this, it's actually super normal, but it's like, hey, let's tune in and look at it and maybe swap out a strategy that actually might work well for you. And this is why it's normal, because everything in us wants to avoid leaning into our pain. Again, like, if you're experiencing pain, it's because something was really important and significant to you. And with like a great sorrow, it comes out of like a place of great love. And it just makes so, like, I think just so compassionately on the fact that, like, of course we would try to avoid all of our pain as much as we could. So how do we actually, if leaning into our pain is part of grieving and grieving well, I guess you could say, I don't know if I want to put that qualifier on there, but we kind of want to think, how do we actually do this then, in a way that isn't avoidant, but also allows us to continue to live our lives? And I think the solution is that we actually need to be doing this reflective work kind of all the time in little segments. So I think that there's two ways that this can go. Our loss and pain can pile up. So it can either destroy our soul, or it can be used to expand it. That's kind of what we're going to circle around here. And, you know, there's this, Jerry Sitzer, the guy who writes A Grace Disguised, he talks about this fact that it almost feels like grief will turn in on itself and it will literally shatter your soul. That there's something so terrible about it that it will literally like destroy you in a moment of grief. And again, that's why we try to avoid it, because there's like this all-consumingness about it when we're in like intense grief. It can feel like you'll never make it out of it, and you end up feeling bitter, resentful, this perpetual anger. And I think that because of all those strategies before, people end up being like a dead man walking. I'm not actually really living because I've just numbed out so much of my life. And how, like, have we seen people like this? Do we know people who are like this? I know I've known people who, in some ways, no matter what the circumstances, it seems like they've just given up. Yay, nay?
Yeah.
Even think of even like movie characters you've seen this. Like, okay, something in them has given up. They've decided that pain is too much for them, and it's literally kind of like destroyed them in some ways. Are you even there? Are you even human at that point in time? I think yes, but it feels like there's something lacking. So this is important because it does have a capacity to really train wreck us, especially if like a lot of little griefs stack up on top of each other and become a complex grief. Yeah. But again, Jerry's sister, he talks about loss will not destroy the soul if used to expand it. And, you know, if Inside Out is a good, how many people have seen Inside Out? Yeah? It's like, I love that movie.
I haven't seen it yet.
You haven't seen it yet. It's so worth it. You know, when I was working at Outreach, that nonprofit, I took all my like 17 to 24-year-old students to see a matinee in the middle of the day. And they're like, why are we here watching a cartoon? And I just see them crying out of the corner of my eye. And I'm like, yes, got you. But if Inside Out is maybe let's stuff to the like to where it impacts us negatively, that is not what we want. We want more of this thing that actually maybe our soul is kind of elastic in some ways. And if we actually like lean in and feel our pain, that we can actually like absorb it into our being, into like a whole integrated person. So you asked, when do I actually make it through it? And this is why I kind of think that may be not quite the way to look at it, because I think that if we can, to continue to actually expand in some ways and add it into our experience, add it into what makes up who we are. You know, I know like at a few different points in time I touched on this point that like, oh, we're really actually limited beings in some ways. Our bodies, life is very fragile. So how much does like our grief actually connect us with like the very humanness that we are, but that it makes us more compassionate towards other people. That there is something about like that I can look in the eyes of someone who is in pain and being like, oh gosh, like girl, I know that is actually like really terrible. I'm so sorry, you know, and that there is like this compassion that we're able to emulate because we have expanded in some way, that we can hold that last line. We're able to hold both joy but also sorrow for people, and that we would work to actually be an integrated whole in that way. That we can experience anger, we can experience joy, we can experience fear, we can experience shame, we can experience sadness in a way that is actually not fragmented, but is very integrated, and that we can be a people that can be with somebody in both joy and sorrow. That there's this, if we can make room for sadness in our lives, that it not only impacts us, it impacts our communities around us too. So this is taken from that Prescriptions and Descriptions book. I'm forgetting the author off the top of my head, but it's referenced at the beginning. I'm just going to read these out loud, actually. I think that they are in opposition, and yet somehow in the kingdom of God they go together. So the first one is, it is a kingdom agenda to relieve our suffering, and it is a kingdom agenda to redeem us or transform us through our suffering. So God both wants to get rid and alleviate, but he also somehow uses our suffering in a way that, not that we're supposed to seek out suffering. You know, I think that that's some bad theology right there. I know a lot of people that are like that, and I'm like, no. Yeah, so we're not supposed to. Yeah, so we're not supposed to like actively chase suffering to be better Christians. I think that's getting it wrong. But there, what were you gonna say?
It's coming. Don't rush the boat.
Exactly. It's like if you just, there's something about this, the very first title page is how do we grieve well knowing that suffering's a given. You don't have to chase after it.
It's gonna
Because of the human experience and because pain is just part of this growth and pain, like growth and death are kind of a part of anything organic, anything living. So it will come for you. Don't seek out after it. But isn't this like interesting that it's like, oh, we think about the time in heaven. You quoted, every tear will be wiped away. This terribleness around sadness will be gone, and God wants to alleviate that.
Yeah.
And yet, even like we look at Job, what an interesting take on sorrow and loss that God actually, I think, in some ways, used that to transform and grow Job into a more wise understanding of who God is. So there's these things that, do those really go together? How do we do that as Christians when it's like, how do I tell how do I discern between what's going on here? And I think that it's never either or. I think it's always both. Same thing for this, that too much suffering can be hazardous to spiritual growth, and too little suffering can be hazardous to spiritual growth. I have known people that because of their experiences, they've turned away from God. I cannot accept God because my life has been so hard. Or I've seen other people go through atrocities. There's something really terrible about trauma that shifts our perspective of who God is. That too much of this sorrow thing actually can be really bad for us. But, maybe even especially we think of like Western Christianity, our American version of Christianity. There's like a comfort in that. And then we think of our brothers and sisters across the globe who are in dire straits. And how does that maybe, there's a lot, again, not that we should seek out suffering, but maybe there's a lot of spiritual growth that we don't actually move through in the same way because it's less hazardous in some ways, So how do we, really I put these up here because I think it's this type of thing, again, is not clear cut. It's not do this and you're fine. It's more of it's almost like a philosophical conversation in some ways of how do we just be in a world where pain exists and we try to make sense of it under the umbrella of like who God is. So do anybody have any thoughts, comments, questions, anything before we move into kind of some practicality? I feel like I have something I would like to say. Going back to this, I think a really beautiful picture of this, and again, it's taken from, I believe, Jerry's book. He talks about a tree that gets struck by lightning. And it's really interesting. I don't know if it's a certain type of trees or if all trees do this, but if a tree gets struck by lightning, it actually turns in on itself. And it tries to care for its wound. And then, it actually ends up becoming like really sought after wood because it ends up being this like really beautiful, it's not that traditional grain pattern. It's this really kind of, on the outside, it looks like a gnarl in the tree, but on the inside, it's so beautiful. And people actually seek after it because it's like really valuable. And I think that like, if we can, maybe there is a time of turning in and grieving and caring for this like wounded part of us. Because again, great love equals great sorrow. There's something really important that we've lost. And at the same time, maybe eventually use that to contribute to the world in a really beautiful way. So I put 6 different things that are just kind of both practical and a little reflective. The first one, this picture of a threshold, I just want to give you this picture to carry with you for the rest of your life. It was really, whether it resonates with you or not, I guess we'll determine if you carry it with you, but it resonated with me, is that if we think of times of transition as thresholds, that if I'm standing in that doorway, on the threshold of something, I'm no longer in this room, but I have not yet stepped into what's to come. And I think that anytime we're in transition between a job or a death of somebody or just any of these different things, that it is just like a really unique time to take stock in life. Where am I coming from? What was that all about? And where am I headed? If we think about it, even in like, let's think about it in the sense of a job or a birth. A job, maybe someone's getting promoted. You know, it's like, ooh, I'm excited to like move forward into this new thing, whether a new company or a new position. But there's a sadness because I'm leaving my team behind. Life as I know it has ceased to exist. And when we're in those middle spaces, that we would actually evaluate some of that. Again, it doesn't always have to be a bad that you're entering into. I think a lot of times we think of grief in those terms, but any transition is kind of a grief and a loss. A woman who is pregnant and is so excited to have her baby, but like life with no kids has ceased to exist,
Lord
you know?
Jesus.
And that there's
That's
like,
real.
like when she holds that, it's like, oh, there is a joy in holding this baby, and like I can't wait for her life to go forward. But there's also a grief or a loss in some ways, or even moving from one kid to 2 or 3 or 4. You know, that life as I know it has ceased to exist. So really, I think to create a rhythm of grieving, in some ways, that like this is what I mean by being a grieving people. How do we maybe even just personally take even sometimes like 5 minutes to just like sit, take a few deep breaths and think through, man, what are the transitions I'm going through in my life right now? And what does that mean for me around loss? And what is God maybe doing in the midst of that? But that like, I think that this is a real reflection on our humanity again, that we're limited. We need to actually be, even think of Sabbath, 6 days work, 1 day rest. I think that that in of itself is a God-given reminder that we are just human, and that we are supposed to be resting and kind of reflecting on our limitations, and really thankful that God is not that way, you know. But how do we create this rhythm within us? The second point, as much as you can to do this process in front of people, I think is helpful for your own self. It is powerful for the people who experience it, because you give them permission to grieve. And that, I think, you know, that like, it's a connected community who feels both joy and sorrow together. How can we do the highs and lows of life? Don't compare losses. Ooh, this one really gets me. I think that whole categorization of pain, in some ways, you know, the way our brains work is we're always trying to fit things in categories so we can be the most prepared for it. But someone's pain is someone's pain. And I think that if we start to, you know, I've used my mom a lot in examples today, but I think that sometimes when I'm talking to her, she'll be like, oh, other people have it so much worse. And that doesn't land right with me. And we have conversations about it all the time, actually. This is not like an unknown thing, that if she would see this, she would be like, yeah, well, okay. But this kind of like dismissiveness, and it's like, oh, yeah, I understand that there's people who live in the slums. You're right, they have it really bad. This is also painful for me. And we can like honor that for what it is. So I think that like, in reality, if we start to compare losses, we all lose, because there's like no permission, nobody's actually doing this whole thing. And again, instead of maybe responding in a way that says, oh, but somebody has it so much worse, aren't you? Or even like, aren't you thankful that it wasn't like this? It's not that bad. Trying to like put it in perspective. I think that that's not helpful to people, but instead, like, as much as you can, ask around the meaning and purpose someone is making around it. What it like, and maybe they don't know, and maybe you just sit in that space of I don't know yet. Maybe one day I will, but right now I don't know. I think it's really, isn't it amazing that nothing we experience surprises God? Like, there's nothing that can shock, anger, or surprise our God. So whatever emotion we are in our grief, that we can actually bring that to God. Again, like look at the picture of Job, who was like raging before God in some ways. And it's like, eventually God was like, okay, cut it out because of look who I am, you know? But even in that, some of it was really acceptable. Or like the prophets who are like in dire straits. So I think just like giving yourself permission, I think that there's something about our sorrow that focuses us. How many times, I don't know, like in talking to people or, you know, even with me transitioning at work, out of directly seeing counseling clients right now, there's like a sadness there for me, because I've been a therapist for now like 7+ years. And that's like who I am. That's part of my identity.
Break in those 7 years?
I've had no break in those 7 years, ish.
Yeah.
And like just in making that transition, part of me like doing some of that is how can I reevaluate what's really important, to actually focus us on what's important in life. And then this I think is kind of what is all wrapped up in this whole thing, is we want to be a people that can hold both sorrow and joy together. And that we can actually, the way the human body works, the way our minds work, is that we have the capacity to hold within us so much more than one thing at a time. And sometimes it feels so full. It feels like, oh my gosh, I can't hold all this. But again, that maybe there's something elastic about humanity that we can continue to hold more and more and more by the grace of God. I think, maybe just to end on this, I was walking through this with our church, a similar presentation months and months ago, and I was looking at my old notes, and I was reading this, and I thought this might just be a nice way to end as we reflect on what does this mean as people of faith. So I'm just gonna read this, but maybe before, let me check the time. Maybe, yeah. Maybe if you guys have more discussion among yourselves, when I'm out of here, that would be great. But let me just read this, and then we can end our time together. So, our loss brings us face to face with our smallness and mortality. In Scripture, Jesus is called the man of sorrows, one who can empathize with our weakness, one that in the garden thought the burden of what God was calling him to was too great, and literally wept blood from physiological stress of the situation. We may be small and human mortals, but Christ is both human and divine, and in the face of mortality and fragility, Jesus has overcome death on our behalf and given us access to the ultimate secure and safe being. Suffering is a given on this earth. We will all face it. But will it expand our souls and point us forward with longing to the day when every tear will be wiped away?